My name is Sirvani Kurvanti, and I will be discussing the chemical disaster of Seveso, Italy. So I'll begin by giving a brief overview of the chemical disasters in Seveso, Italy, then talk about the TCDD exposure and Seveso and how TCDD really does affect the population. This presentation will first look at what happened in Seveso, Italy, then TCDD, then contamination zones, then graphs on animal exposure, children exposure, maternal exposure, deaths, and finally references. So, what exactly happened in Seveso, Italy? So, there was this chemical plant which was created by ICMESA, which is a subsidiary of a bigger company called Hoffman La Roche. And this chemical plant, which is located in Maida, Italy, was not really seen to be such an inconvenience or anything to the general population that lived around there. Not many people were affected. They didn't really think it was something dangerous. But one weekend on Saturday, July 10th, 1976, at approximately 12:37 p.m. in the afternoon, the chemical plant, which was shut down for the weekend, its cooling mechanisms were turned off. This caused the temperature to reach a critical level, and eventually the pressure release valve was opened and toxic gas was emitted from the facility into the neighboring residential populations. So what exactly is TCDD? TCDD is known as 2,3,7,7 tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, and it's a type of dioxin which is known to be a byproduct of industrial activities such as bleaching, and it's also a recognized carcinogen. And the way it affects the body is that it can accumulate in fatty tissues. It can cause reproductive, immunity, development effects in animals. It can also cause severe liver problems and chloracne, which is a serious skin condition that resembles bad acne. It can be ingested by eating plants or animals, and the first people in this town to get affected were animals to TCDD and Seveso. The affected area was divided up into three different zones. Zone A is heavy exposure zone, which is TCDD soil levels 15.5 to 580 micrograms per meter squared. Zone B is medium exposure. TCDD soil concentration did not exceed 5 micrograms per meter squared. Zone R, which is low exposure, soil concentration is below 1.5. Animals were the first to get exposed to TCDD, and immediately after the TCDD exposure, over 3,300 animals, mostly poultry and rabbits, were found dead. This graph kind of looks at the mortality of rabbits in the Seveso accident area divided by the exposure zones. So as you can see, high exposure had the highest rate of mortality in rabbits at 31.90%, and the low exposure zone R had the lowest mortality rate of rabbits, which was 6.80%. Another vulnerable population, children, were seen to have a high rate of chloracne cases. This specific graph looks at the chloracne cases in children aged 3 to 14 years old in an 8-month period after the accident. So here you can see the three contamination zones: high risk, medium risk, low risk. On top of that, we have the high exposure zone, max, which is defined as the area closest to the factory, and then low exposure, polio, which is the part of zone R, which is closest to the factory, and then the reference zone, which is completely unaffected. So, as expected, the high exposure max contamination zone has the highest percentage or prevalence percentage at 48.10 of chloracne cases. And the second highest was the high exposure, and then low exposure polo at 2.50 percentage. Women were another vulnerable population that got exposed to TCDD. This graph shows the pregnancy loss rate by exposure zone and trimester after the Seveso accident. So the first set of data, the July to September 1976, was before the Seveso accident, and immediately after, you can see that there was a surge in the pregnancy loss rates between the medium risk in comparison to the low risk zone up until almost a full year later. The only time the two zones kind of balance out is between September to December of 1977. It's also important to kind of note that this data could be confounded by some external factors such as social, cultural, economic, but it's still interesting to notice the surge in pregnancy loss rates, which could be abortion, stillbirths, or just natural pregnancy loss right after the accident. This interesting study done by Bassarelli et al. Followed women from 1994 to 2005 who were affected by the 1976 Seveso accident and gave birth in different contamination zones. This graph looks at the blood thyroid stimulating hormone level, which is used to screen for congenital hypothyroidism and known to be a sensitive marker for hypothyroidism and a suitable index for the presence of factors that cause alterations in the function of the thyroid gland. So this study showed that the Seveso population, the newborn mothers in the Seveso population with high body burdens of TCDD resulting from the accidental dioxin exposure that happened 20 to 30 years earlier still had higher neonatal BTSH concentrations compared to the newborns of non-exposed women, and the variations in neonatal thyroid function evaluated at birth through the BTSH are associated with changes in iodine availability and maternal intake, especially if they're greater than 5. It means that it's equivalated with a mild iodine deficiency of 3% to 19%, according to the World Health Organization. This graph looks at the mortality rate filtered by the cause of death between people living in Zone A and people living in Zone R. The different causes of death that we kind of filtered by is cancer, which is seen to have the second highest rate of mortality in percentage, and that's because TCDD is a known carcinogen. We also look at digestive disease, respiratory disease, circulatory disease, which was the highest mortality rate in percentage at 4.10 for high exposure and 0.66 for low exposure, and then we look at diabetes. To summarize, this devastating chemical exposure that overnight affected thousands of Seveso residents has serious and fast-acting dangers. Among the first to suffer were the animals, and then women were another population severely affected by TCDD. It affected pregnancy and thyroid levels. People in Zone A by August had been completely evacuated as serious health problems arose, for example, the chloracne and many deaths due to cancer, respiratory, cardiovascular diseases. So overall, this was a very devastating and a terrible disaster.